I had just moved into my new lake house. Boxes were still unpacked. The dock was quiet. The water was calm. Then the HOA stormed in. They started yelling that the lake belonged to the community. They demanded access, fees, and control of the shoreline. One of them even said I had no right to block their docks. They were loud, confident, smiling like they'd done this before, but they made one huge mistake. They didn't read the property lines, they didn't check the records, and they didn't realize I controlled every dock on that lake. And what happened next shut the entire HOA down. I had just moved into my new lake house. Boxes were still stacked against the walls, some unopened, some half crushed from being moved too many times. The smell of fresh paint mixed with wood and lake air. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was mine. After years of noise, deadlines, and people telling me what I could and couldn't do, this place was supposed to be quiet. That was the whole point. Outside, the lake was smooth like glass. No boats, no shouting, just water, trees, and sky. I stood by the window for a moment, coffee in my hand, thinking I had finally made the right decision. Then I heard footsteps, not light footsteps, not someone unsure where they were going. These were fast, confident steps, multiple people moving together. I looked out the front window and saw 3 strangers coming straight up my driveway. No wave, no pause, no hesitation. They didn't knock. The front door opened like it belonged to them. "This is HOA business," a woman said loudly as she stepped inside, clipboard already in her hand. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask if this was a good time. She just started walking, looking around my house like she was inspecting damage. 2 others followed her in, nodding and murmuring like they were backing her up. I stood there in silence, still holding my coffee, trying to understand what was happening. "We need to talk about the lake," the woman continued. "You're blocking community access." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She pointed out the window toward the water. "That lake is shared property. The docks are for everyone. You can't just move in and lock people out." Her tone wasn't angry, it was worse. It was confident, like she had done this many times before and never been challenged. One of the men added, "We've already had complaints. Residents are upset." "Residents?" I asked. "I just moved in yesterday." "That doesn't matter," the woman said quickly. "HOA rules apply immediately." She flipped through papers on her clipboard and started listing things I had allegedly violated. Dock, access, signage, keys, community use. The words blurred together. None of it made sense. I asked them to stop for a moment. "Can you tell me exactly what rule I've broken?" They talked over me. "You're required to provide access. You can't control shoreline structures. The docks belong to the HOA." The woman leaned forward slightly and said, "You'll need to hand over the dock keys." That's when I finally understood what this was. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't enforcement. It was a demand. I set my coffee down carefully and looked at them one by one. They were relaxed, comfortable, smiling in that tight way people do when they believe they already have power. I walked to the window and looked out at the lake again. The dock sat quietly along the shore, solid and well built. I knew exactly what they were and how they came to be. I turned back to them. "Who told you the docks were community property?" The woman scoffed. "Everyone knows that that's not an answer," I said. She sighed dramatically. "Look, new owners always push back, then they learn." That sentence stuck with me. New owners always push back, then they learn. It told me this wasn't the first time they'd done this. It told me intimidation had worked before. It told me people probably handed over keys just to make it stop. One of the men crossed his arms. "If you don't comply, fines will start immediately." "How much?" I asked. He smiled. "Enough." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because something had become very clear. They hadn't checked anything. They hadn't checked the deed. They hadn't checked the shoreline survey. They hadn't checked dock rights. They had walked in assuming I would fold. I walked to a small box near the wall, still unopened. I knew exactly what was inside it. I didn't open it yet. I just rested my hand on the lid and looked back at them. "You're very confident," I said calmly. The woman smiled wider. "We know what we're doing." "No," I replied. "You know what you've been getting away with." Her smile faded slightly. I continued, "Before you demand keys to something, you should probably confirm who controls it." She laughed. "We do." I shook my head. "You don't." The room went quiet. They stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. I took a slow breath and said the words that changed everything. "I control every dock on that lake." For a moment, no one reacted. Then the woman laughed again, louder this time. "That's not how this works." I met her eyes. "It is when the property records say so." The confidence in the room cracked just a little. They didn't know it yet, but they had just stormed into the wrong house, made the wrong demands, and challenged the one thing they never expected: someone who already held the keys. They spread their papers across my kitchen table like they were laying claim to territory. Maps first, then printed diagrams, then pages of fine schedules and community guidelines. The woman with the clipboard took control of the room without asking. She pointed at the lake on one of the maps and spoke as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. "This entire shoreline is considered shared," she said. "That includes dock access." One of the men leaned forward and tapped a page with his finger. "You have 30 days to reopen access. If you don't, fines will begin immediately." "How much?" I asked. He didn't give a number. He just smiled again. "Enough to get your attention." Another man, quieter than the others but clearly enjoying the moment, added, "And if you don't comply, the docks can be reassigned to the community." "Reassigned?" I repeated. "Yes," he said. "It happens all the time." I looked at the maps more closely. They were generic, simplified. Lines drawn thick and vague with labels that meant nothing legally. There were no county stamps, no surveyor names, no reference numbers, just HOA letterhead and confident arrows pointing wherever they wanted them to point. I stayed calm. That seemed to irritate them. People who rely on intimidation expect visible reactions, raised voices, defensive posture, panic. When none of that showed, they grew louder to compensate. "You're required to comply," the woman said sharply. "This is non-negotiable." I nodded once. "Can you show me where it says that?" She froze for half a second. Then she ignored the question completely. Instead, she launched into a speech about community standards, harmony, and shared responsibility. She talked faster now, like speed alone could cover the lack of substance. The men backed her up with overlapping comments. "Everyone else complies. You're not special. This neighborhood has rules." They talked over me every time I tried to speak. One of them said, "New owners always push back at first. Then they learn the hard way." That phrase again, learn the hard way. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat dressed up as experience. I realized then that this wasn't about docks or access. It was about control. They expected resistance. They expected confusion. They expected me to eventually give in just to make the pressure stop. They had probably done this dozens of times before. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. "You still haven't answered my question." The woman sighed loudly. "Look, we don't need to debate paperwork. We're the HOA. We decide how shared spaces are used." "According to what?" I asked. She pointed at her clipboard. "According to this." I picked it up gently and flipped through it. The pages were filled with internal HOA policies. Rules written by the HOA for the HOA and enforced by the HOA. None of it referenced actual property ownership. None of it referenced county records. I set it back down. "These aren't property deeds." Her jaw tightened. "Don't get technical," one of the men said. "This is how it works." "That depends," I replied, "on who owns what." The room went quiet for a moment. The woman narrowed her eyes. "Are you saying you don't recognize the HOA's authority?" "I'm saying authority has limits," I said calmly. That was the moment their patience snapped. The tone shifted from confident to aggressive. Voices rose, words sharpened. They talked about lawyers, liens, and lawsuits. They talked about dragging things out until it cost me more than it was worth. "You'll spend more fighting this than you will just cooperating," the quiet man said. That sentence was familiar too. It was the sound of someone who had scared people into submission before. I looked at each of them carefully. None of them looked worried. None of them looked uncertain. They believed what they were doing was untouchable, not because it was legal, but because it had worked. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the lake was still calm. Sunlight reflected off the water in soft ripples. The docks sat exactly where they had for years, solid and unmoved by shouting or paper threats. I turned back to them. "You're asking me to give up control of something you haven't proven you own," the woman scoffed. "We don't have to prove anything." That told me everything. I walked to the unopened box near the wall again and rested my hand on it. I didn't open it yet. I just let the gesture sit there unanswered. "You're making a mistake," one of the men warned. "No," I said. "I'm recognizing one." They gathered their papers abruptly, annoyed now, no longer pretending to be friendly. The woman snapped her clipboard shut and pointed at me. "You have 30 days, she said. "After that, enforcement begins." I nodded. "I'll be ready." She laughed, but it sounded forced this time. People always say that they walked out the same way they came in, confident, loud, and certain they'd won. The door closed behind them. The house felt quiet again, but now it was the quiet that comes before a storm. because they had made one fatal assumption. They assumed intimidation would work. They assumed I hadn't checked the records. They assumed I didn't already know exactly what I owned. And when they came back, because I knew they would, the conversation would be very different. What they didn't know was that I had already done my homework long before the moving truck ever pulled into the driveway. Buying a lake house isn't something you do casually. There are water rights, shoreline rules, easements, permits, and decades of history buried in paperwork most people never read. I read all of it, every page, every note, every line written in small print at the bottom. Because I've learned something important over the years. People who rush you are usually hiding something. When I first became interested in the PR property, the real estate agent warned me about the HOA. She said they were very involved and protective of the lake. Those words stuck with me. Not because they scared me, but because they sounded vague. Vague language often covers over messy truths. So I asked questions. I asked about dock ownership. I asked about shoreline access. I asked about historical agreements. Most buyers don't. They just assume shared water means shared control. I didn't assume anything. That's when I found it, years earlier, long before the current HOA leadership ever existed. The previous owner had gone through a long legal process. At the time, the shoreline had been neglected and poorly managed. Docks were falling apart, access was chaotic, arguments were constant. Instead of fighting year after year, the owner did something smart. He bought the rights, legally, carefully, permanently. He negotiated with individual landholders and secured dock permits for the entire shoreline. He paid for surveys, environmental reviews, and county approvals. It took years. It wasn't cheap. But when it was done, the dock rights were his alone, not leased, not shared, owned. Those rights were recorded with the county. They were attached to the property deed, and most importantly, they transferred automatically with the sale of the land, which meant when I signed the papers, they became mine. I remembered sitting in the title office as the clerk slid a thick stack of documents across the desk. She pointed to one page in particular and said, "Most people don't understand how important this one is." I read it twice. Dock rights, transferred in full. I asked her if there were any disputes. She shook her head. "There used to be," she said, "but the paperwork is solid. The HOA tried to challenge it years ago. They lost." That sentence stayed with me. They tried, they lost. And when the HOA stormed into my house, acting confident, acting entitled, acting like they controlled the lake, I already knew something they didn't. They were repeating a story that had already failed once, and I suspected they were hoping no one would ever check again. Back in my empty living room, after they left, I finally opened the box near the wall. Inside was a neatly organized folder wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. The edges were worn, but the pages inside were pristine. Surveys, county permits, recorded deeds, official stamps, everything they claimed to own, they didn't. Everything they threatened me over, they had no legal right to touch. I spread the documents out on the table and read through them again, slowly, calmly, making sure nothing had changed. It hadn't. The law doesn't shift just because someone speaks louder. I realized then how confident they must have felt walking into my home. How many people before me must have backed down the moment those clipboards appeared. How many dock keys had been handed over without a fight. Not because the HOA was right, but because intimidation works when people don't know their rights. That's what they didn't expect. They didn't expect a new owner who had already read the past. They didn't expect someone who knew the lake better on paper than they did in practice. They didn't expect facts. They expected fear. I closed the folder and slid it back into the box. I wasn't angry. I wasn't excited. I was patient, because the truth didn't need to be shouted. It just needed the right moment. And that moment would come soon. The HOA had given me 30 days. They thought those 30 days would pressure me into compliance. They didn't realize those 30 days were a gift. Time to prepare, time to document, time to let them dig deeper into a hole they didn't know they were standing in when they came back. And I was certain I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't threaten. I would simply show them what they should have checked before they ever stepped through my door. And once the truth was on the table, the lake would never be the same for them again. When the yelling finally stopped, the silence felt heavy, not peaceful, not calm, heavy. The HOA members stood in my living room, arms crossed, papers clutched tight, breathing just a little faster than before. Their voices had grown hoarse from talking over one another. Threats had been made. Deadlines had been given. Confidence had been displayed, like armor, and then it ran out. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I've learned over time that silence makes people uncomfortable when they don't control the situation. It forces them to think. It forces them to notice details they were ignoring, like the fact that I wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, and wasn't backing down. I walked calmly to the box near the wall. No dramatic movement, no raised voice, no announcement. I opened it slowly and removed the folder inside, thick, well organized. Worn at the edges but solid, the kind of folder that had been opened many times over many years, not something printed the night before. The woman with the clipboard scoffed when she saw it. "More paperwork," she said. "This doesn't change anything." I didn't respond. I carried the folder to the kitchen table and placed it down gently as if I were setting something fragile in front of them. Then I opened it. I didn't explain yet. I laid the papers out one by one. First the property deed, then the shoreline survey, then the dock permits. Each page had official seals, county stamps, surveyor signatures, dates going back years, long before the current HOA leadership had ever existed. The room slowly went quiet. The first man leaned forward, squinting at the documents. He stopped smiling. The second man picked up a page without asking and scanned it quickly, then slower. His eyebrows pulled together. The woman finally stepped closer. "What is this?" she asked, though her voice wasn't confident anymore. "These," I said calmly, "are the documents you should have checked before coming here." She flipped through them faster now, too fast, like she was hoping to find a mistake by sheer speed alone. Her finger traced lines on the survey map, following the shoreline, the docks, the access points. Her face changed, not all at once, but enough. "This can't be right," she said quietly. "It is," I replied. One of the men swallowed hard. "The HOA has always controlled dock access." "No," I said. "The HOA has always claimed it." I pointed to the permits. These were issued individually, legally. They were consolidated under one owner years ago. The room felt smaller now. One man sat down without realizing he was doing it. The other folded his arms tighter, but it wasn't confidence anymore. It was defense. The woman flipped to the final page, transfer of rights upon sale. She read it twice, then a third time. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "Every dock," I continued calmly, "every access point, every section of shoreline you mentioned earlier." I tapped the document lightly. "Belongs to me." The silence stretched. A whisper broke it. "That can't be possible," one of them muttered. "It's not only possible," I said. "It's recorded." The woman looked up sharply. "Why would the HOA allow this?" "They didn't," I answered. "They challenged it." All three of them froze. "And they lost," I added. That was the moment confidence cracked, completely. Not anger, not shouting, cracking, the kind that spreads quietly. The man who had threatened fines earlier rubbed his face with both hands. "This is going to be a problem." "For who?" I asked. He didn't answer. The woman closed the folder slowly, carefully now, as if it might explode if handled wrong. She stood there, staring at the table, not at me. "This changes things," she said finally. "Yes," I replied, "it does." Her voice dropped. "We'll need to review this." "You should," I said. "With a lawyer." No one argued that the power dynamic had shifted completely. They were no longer enforcing rules. They were reacting to facts, and facts don't care about confidence. They gathered their papers quietly now. No more pointing, no more threats, no more deadlines. When they headed for the door, it wasn't with authority, it was with uncertainty. Before leaving, the woman turned back. "You should have told us sooner," she said weakly. I met her eyes. "You should have asked." They left without another word. The door closed. The house felt calm again. Not the uneasy calm from before, but real calm. The kind that comes after truth is spoken out loud and there's no way to take it back. I gathered the documents and slid them back into the folder, then returned it to the box. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need it out anymore. The lake outside was still, unbothered, unmoved, patient, just like the truth. The threat stopped immediately, not slowly, not gradually, immediately. The moment the truth was laid out on the table, the tone changed so fast it was almost unsettling. The same people who had walked into my house with raised voices and demands now spoke carefully, choosing their words as if each one carried risk. The woman who had led the charge cleared her throat and forced a thin smile. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot," she said. "There's no reason this has to be hostile." Hostile, that word told me everything. A few minutes earlier they had been confident, certain, loud. Now they wanted to talk about tone. One of the men nodded eagerly. "Yes, we're all reasonable people, her. The HOA just wants harmony." Harmony hadn't mattered when they were threatening fines. Another added, there might be ways to work together. Shared use agreements, temporary access, something fair. Fair? That word came late too. They circled the table again, not as enforcers now, but as negotiators who knew they were standing on thin ice. Their posture changed. Arms uncrossed, voices lowered. No more pointing at the lake through the window. They were no longer telling me what would happen. They were asking. I listened quietly while they talked themselves into softer and softer positions. They suggested compromises they never would have considered an hour earlier. They floated ideas about limited hours, seasonal access, friendly arrangements that sounded cooperative on the surface, but were clearly designed to salvage some control. When they finally paused, waiting for my response, I shook my head. No, I said, just that. No explanation, no apology, no counteroffer. The woman blinked. You're not even willing to discuss it? I already did, I replied. You chose demands over discussion. Her face tightened. We're just trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. This is the conflict, I said calmly. And it's already happened. That was when the panic truly set in. The quiet man, the one who had threatened lawyers earlier, leaned forward, his confidence gone. You need to understand, he said, this affects the whole community. So did your actions, I replied. They exchanged looks, real ones this time. The kind people share when they realize the story they've been telling themselves won't hold up under scrutiny. They left soon after. No deadlines, no final warnings, just a promise to review things internally. But I knew better. Within 48 hours, the first letter arrived, not from the HOA, from a law firm. It was carefully worded, full of polite language and vague concern. It asked for copies of documents. It requested clarification. It suggested a meeting. I sent back exactly what they asked for, everything. The response was silence. Then another letter came, this time from a different firm, then emails, then phone calls, then a sudden request for time. That's when the dominoes started falling. Someone in the HOA had finally done what they should have done years ago. They checked the records, and when they did, they found more than just dock rights. They found a trail, fees collected for access they didn't own, permits claimed without authority, rules enforced where no jurisdiction existed. What they thought was a small mistake turned out to be systemic. Auditors were brought in, not because I demanded it, but because the HOA panicked and tried to get ahead of what they suddenly realized was unavoidable. Refunds were discussed, then required, then calculated. Homeowners noticed. People talk when money is involved, first quietly, then openly. Why are we paying for dock access? Who approved this? Where did the money go? Meetings grew tense. Board members avoided eye contact. Statements were made and walked back. Explanations contradicted earlier explanations. The HOA's authority, built on confidence and assumption, started to crumble under questions. It could no longer dodge. I received calls from neighbors I hadn't even met yet. Some were confused, some were angry, some were relieved to finally understand why things never made sense. One woman said, we always thought something felt off. Another said, they told us everyone paid the same. They hadn't. The truth spread faster than any official notice ever could. By the end of the week, the HOA announced a temporary pause on all lake-related enforcement. Dock access rules were suspended pending review. Fines were frozen. Committees were formed. Committees meant delay. Delay meant fear. They were buying time, but time was no longer on their side because once people start asking questions, silence doesn't work anymore. And once records are open, they don't close quietly. The HOA had tried to control the lake through intimidation. Instead, they had exposed themselves, and there was no undoing that. Today, the lake is quiet again, not the nervous quiet that comes from people being afraid to speak, not the tense quiet that hangs in the air when trouble feels close. This is real quiet, the kind you hear when nothing is wrong. The water stretches out in front of my dock, smooth and steady. In the early morning, mist rises gently from the surface, drifting like breath in the cool air. Birds skim low across the lake, touching the water for just a second before lifting back into the sky. The docks sit exactly where they've always been, solid, unmoved, untouched. No OPA patrols, no clipboards, no strangers marching onto my land like they own it. For the first time since I moved in, the lake feels like what it was meant to be, peaceful. The HOA doesn't send letters anymore. No warnings, no friendly reminders, no threats disguised as policy. Their office is still there, but it's quiet now too. Meetings are short, attendance is low, people have stopped whispering and started living again. The lake isn't a battlefield anymore, it's just water. I walk down to the dock most mornings with a cup of coffee and stand there for a while listening. The soft slap of water against the wood, the distant hum of a boat far across the lake, the wind moving through trees along the shoreline. No one tells me what I can or can't do here, because they can't. The truth settled everything in a way shouting never could. The HOA stopped talking about community lake rights. Almost overnight. The phrase vanished from emails, from meetings, from their website. It was like it had never existed at all. Funny how fast authority disappears when it's built on nothing solid. Neighbors wave when they pass now. Some stop to talk. Not about rules, not about fees, just normal things. Weather, fishing, how calm the lake looks in the evening. A few have thanked me quietly, not like I did something heroic, but like I did something necessary. One man told me, "We always thought they owned more than they really did." Another said, "No one ever checked, we just believed them." That's how fake authority survives. Not through strength, not through law, but through assumption. People assume someone else has already checked. People assume the loudest voice must be right. People assume it's easier to comply than to question. Until someone finally does. The HOA board went through changes after that. Some members resigned, others stayed silent. New policies were announced, carefully written, stripped of any mention of control they didn't legally have. Refunds were quietly processed. Apologies were never public, but they didn't need to be. The lake itself didn't care. It stayed calm through all of it. Water doesn't respond to pressure or threats. It doesn't react to shouting. It just stays where it is, shaped only by truth, by land, gravity, and time. That's something I think about often now. Fake authority only works when no one challenges it. Confidence collapses when facts show up, and power that isn't real can't survive sunlight. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted my home. And sometimes standing your ground doesn't mean raising your voice or slamming doors. Sometimes it means opening a folder, laying out the truth, and letting silence do the rest. The HOA stormed in thinking they were teaching a lesson. Instead, they learned one. And now when I step on to the dock and look out across the water, there's nothing left to argue about. The lake is quiet again, exactly the way it should be.